Welcome to the third part of today's mini-lecture. In this segment I will go over Crito, your reading today by Plato. In the Crito, Plato's character Socrates attempts to answer the questions that continue to guide ethicists today. Namely, Socrates tries to answer the questions, what is the good life and how does one achieve this? His answer reminds me of the following joke. A man went into the doctor and asked how long he would live. The doctor replied, I can't tell you for certain, but tell me a bit about your lifestyle and I can take a guess. The man responds, I go to bed every night at 9 and wake up at 5. I run 3 miles every day, never eat any fatty foods, and have never had a sip of alcohol. I don't attend loud gatherings, don't dance, and don't get too excited. I follow the food pyramid perfectly. The doctor looks back at the man and says, why on earth would you want to live that life for a long time? Why does the Crito remind me of this joke? Let's take a look at the dialogue. In the Crito, Plato presents us with two characters. The first is Socrates. He is, if scholars are correct, represented here in a historically accurate way. Socrates was indeed a citizen of Athens, as well as a barefooted eccentric, Plato's teacher and friend, and an all-around busybody. Crito, the second character of the dialogue, is another friend of Socrates and Plato, rather different from both of them. He was an upstanding citizen, the equivalent of a Mayo Clinic CEO. Crito had money, he had influence, and he had a reputation. The group was thus an odd one. If you want to get a modern picture of it, imagine a jail cell where a street preacher and a businessman are talking as best friends, while a college student takes notes in the corner. These, then, are the characters. On to the situation. Socrates' predicament was at least partly his own fault, a fact that his good buddy Crito is not shy of reminding him throughout the dialogue. In Athens, you see, it was custom for juries to find their verdicts in 2 steps. The first step was similar to American court. The jury would hear both sides, deliberate, make a decision, and propose a punishment. In Socrates' case, the jury found him guilty of corrupting the youth and defying the gods. Their proposed punishment was death. After this familiar courtroom style, Athenians threw in a second step. Namely, the guilty Athenian was allowed to offer an alternative punishment, after which the jury would choose between the 2 proposed sentences. Now, one would think Socrates would have proposed a fairly harsh punishment for himself if he wanted to escape the death penalty, perhaps banishment or some sort of giant fine. But Socrates had never been a crowd pleaser. Thus he proposed that, instead of being put to death, he should be given free meals in the Hall of Heroes for the rest of his life. You can imagine how well this went over. Needless to say, then, Crito opens after Socrates has been sentenced to death. Crito has decided to use his political influence and financial power to save his best friend. Most of us can imagine that we would do much the same if we were put in the same situation. Even so, before visiting Socrates in jail, Crito has paid off the guards, arranged an escape, and even talked to some of his foreign friends to set up a place for Socrates to stay. But when Crito shares this plan with his philosophical chum, Socrates declines. In the dialogue that follows, that is, in the reading for today, Socrates attempts to explain why he will not escape, but instead face the punishment demanded by Athens. The initial arguments Crito gives Socrates, and that begin the reading for the day, are similar to the ones we would tell a friend who was refusing to escape death. Crito argues, if you stay, you're just killing yourself. If you die, your enemies win. And what about your children, Socrates? What are they going to do? And what are people going to say about me if I don't help my best friend? Besides, if you give up, you're kind of just a weakling. Personally, I thought these arguments were pretty convincing. If I were Socrates, I would have said, okay, Crito, you convinced me, let's get out of here. But Socrates still resists. Why? The answer, or the beginning of the answer, lies on page 10, and is the reason this dialogue reminds me of the joke with which I began. Namely, Socrates tells Crito that not life, but a good life is to be chiefly valued. Of course, the doctor in the joke above has a slightly different idea about what the good life consists in, but the basic opinions of Socrates and the doctor are close. Both feel that life is simply not worth living unless it is lived appropriately, that, to put it differently, the ethical life is more important than life itself. Having thus put forward this claim, Socrates goes on to explain why he thus cannot leave. The good life, Socrates begins, is acting in a consistently wise and just manner. One should thus live like this despite the circumstances one finds oneself in, since justice is not dependent on circumstances. Justice is constant. Now, there are at least two parts of the just living that are applicable to the choice I must make. First, a just person should obey those who have cared for him, and second, a just person should keep promises. Since Athens has raised me, educated me, and nurtured me, I must obey what it asks. Furthermore, I had made an unspoken promise with Athens to live by its rules when I agreed to live here. Therefore, if I am to flee, I would be disobeying the state which has cared for me, and breaking my promise to be faithful to it, thus performing an unjust action. Now, since living justly is the good life, and as the good life is more important to me than life itself, it would do me more harm than good to flee for exile. Socrates' argument here is an interesting one. Perhaps some of you find it convincing down to the finest detail. Perhaps some of you feel, in other words, that breaking promises and disobeying your caregivers is always unjust, that living justly is the good life, and that the good life is more important than anything, and that Socrates should thus stay and die. I'm not sure that I necessarily buy all of this. I know I wouldn't personally follow Socrates' advice if it was my neck on the line. I would definitely be in exile, sipping some fruit drink on the beach. This said, I think it is important to take the argument to heart. Does Socrates do a good job of describing a just living? More generally, is living according to justice in fact what makes up the good ethical life? Ultimately, though, while both of these questions are good and important ones to be asked, neither of them gets at the reason I assigned you this reading. Indeed, the central and most profound question Socrates raises in the Crito is the question of whether or not the good life is more important than life itself. Is ethics really this important? Does finding and living according to ethical ideals really trump all other considerations? Perhaps Socrates and the doctor in the joke with which I began are simply exaggerating. Perhaps ethics is really not this important. Perhaps they are fools to put it on such a pedestal. But what if Socrates and the doctor are correct? If they are, then the task before us, the task of examining the good life and the means of achieving it, could be the most important task of all.